Thank you so much, Roger. And let me first start by saying, I thank Roger and members of the Zumthor Prize Committee for judging our article worthy of that recognition. Speaking for my co-authors, we are both honored and grateful. I'd also like to thank Kelsey Boland for arranging my visit, as well as Roger, and for the students who have met all day today in the School of Communications for their hospitality and just fascinating conversations. I learned a lot from hearing from you about some of the different research you're just beginning in some cases, or well on your way in others. So today I'm going to present narrative mapping as a tool for documenting spatial narratives. More specifically, I'll describe how the team of researchers that Roger just named, and I was fortunate enough to be involved with, developed this mobile method to document the spatial narratives that we say would emerge during tours offered at Southern Plantation museums. At the end of my talk, I will use research that an overlapping team that I was involved with conducted in 2019 and 2020, so I can demonstrate how we used this as part of a suite of methods to determine where discussions of enslavement were placed during house tours at Mount Vernon, Monticello, Montpelier, and Highland, the preserved plantations of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. So let me start with this. Anybody here taking a guided tour? What kind of tour?
When I was studying abroad, we did a lot of guided tours around cities.
Yeah. Anybody else? When you went to a college, did you get a guided tour? Yeah, so if you've been on that kind of a tour, you know that when you follow that guide, or sometimes called an interpreter, or if they're volunteers, we call them docents, they introduce different narrative themes at particular places. And usually they try to anchor their stories by referencing something. It could be a building, it could be a piece of furniture, something that helps to make the story real. And it helps the visitor identify themselves with the story that we're hearing. I'm going to be talking about historical narratives, stories about our past. So that's how guided tours work, but self-guided tours do kind of the same thing. It could be text-driven, it could be a podcast tour, an audio tour. Either way, a narrative is being attached to places as people move through that particular landscape. And so there's some key points, that I'm going to summarize in a different way than are on the slide. Tours, and I'm going to mostly be talking about guided tours, are designed to move people through space. They want to position the bodies of guides and visitors and shape the way visitors experience the narrative and the place within which it is set. That being said, however, if you've been on a tour, you're not passive. You might be fairly quiet, you might be feeling like you're following along, but you comport yourself in a way that helps you engage with the narrative and see what you want to see when you're on a tour like that. And again, in my experience, that's from documenting a bunch of these tours, most people are pretty quiet. While some ask questions, more are going to signal their engagement with the narrative by nodding their head or shaking their head or looking intently at the guide or looking intently away from the guide if they don't really into the story that's being told. If the guide tells a joke, they may laugh. If it's a serious or sobering topic, they may emote that. And then, of course, the visitors do change the narrative verbally when they ask a question or respond maybe to a cue provided by that guide. I also, think you would agree with me that the interpreter's performance of whatever the narrative is matters. They speak the narrative, but they don't just speak it. What they say, where they say it, what artifacts or pieces of material culture they point out, and the emotions they decide to show or not show play major roles in how visitors interact with the tour itself. What we would argue, and we do argue in this piece and in other pieces we have written, these facets of tour experiences mean that spatial narratives are not just written, recited, and received. They emerge in the spaces while the tour is being given. And each iteration of a tour, the narratives will emerge in at least a slightly different way. Because space and movement are key elements of the narratives that emerge during tours, documenting such tours requires what we would call a mobile methodology. A method that requires researchers to move along with their research subjects. In this case, we're mostly interested in how visitors learned about and felt about and responded to the narratives found on the tours. And so we wanted to find a way to see, hear, and feel as much as possible what visitors experience on a tour. So to develop a method that would allow us to map narrative themes and the ways visitors and interpreters realize those themes in the space of a historic home. We, of course, reviewed a variety of mobile methodologies, and if you want to see the reference list at the end, you can take a picture of it. There's a lot of good works up here. But we also used our own experience of taking tours, and in one case, my co-author, Amy Potter, leading tours of Southern plantation museums. And these, of course, informed the development of the method as well. In Amy's experience, having worked as a guide at a plantation museum in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and she, of course, through practice knew that no two tours of the same site are the same. Her tours were different than her colleagues. And while on any one tour, her own tour would vary because of the visitors that were with her. As soon as children are in the room, the tour changes. Somebody asks a question, the tour changes. If somebody sees you spending a lot of time looking at something, the tour changes. If the HVAC system isn't working, the tour changes. All those things mean that, again, the narratives are emerging for that visitor in the moment and in that space. So while we read and learned a lot from previous work on narratives, especially how enslavement is positioned within plantation museums from other works, we were a little suspicious of some of them that seemed to be making authoritative statements based on, we didn't know how many times they took a tour. They may have only visited a day. So we felt like we needed to capture that more systematically. So we wanted to be able to document each tour as many times as we could. In addition, the project that we developed this method for, as documented, this is the book that Dr. Aiden mentioned. The project scope included 15 plantation museums in 3 different regions, and the work was done in the field over almost a 2-year period. At any one week of field work, we might have 20 or so researchers and research assistants split between 5 different sites. Again, so people would be at one point interviewing and surveying visitors, and at another point being told, okay, your turn, go on the tour. And so we need to find a way of adding a little bit of consistency to that whole process. So key to developing consistency is to develop what we like to call a research instrument, right? In this case, it's a form. And because we had done a lot of work at plantation museums and we read the research, we knew that there was a tendency for certain themes to emerge. And so we could create a form. I'll just quickly move to that one. And this is the one we used for the Virginia presidential sites, where we knew that these were likely topics, in addition to the ones we were interested in seeing whether they emerged or not. And so we created this form. It allowed anybody going on the tour, if they started the process by looking at the form, and then they would go on the tour, and when they got off the tour, they would immediately go back to the form. They would circle the themes that they noticed on the tour. Then they would rank the ones that were most prevalent, so the most dominant narrative elements on the tour. We were very much interested in how slavery was discussed, so we had a little bit of a quantitative measurement. Everybody carried a little counter, digital counter in their pocket, and so anytime they heard the word slave, enslaved, slavery, or for these sites, they often named individual enslaved people, and you tried to keep track of, as long as they were clearly referenced as enslaved people. Sometimes they would mention a name and not help people understand what their role was on the plantation. We didn't count if people referred to enslaved people as servants because they were disguising the fact that they were enslaved, so we didn't count those. Then in addition to those quantitative aspects, we had some more qualitative questions. We wanted to kind of know what tones were used, how slavery and enslavement was discussed, whether they talked about the president as an enslaver or not, and other more qualitative aspects, including, hey, how did the guy use emotion? What kind of questions did visitors ask? And those things that gave us a fuller understanding of what the tour was like. Sorry, my iPad just went. All right. And as you can see, number 8 at the bottom, please use the attached maps of the grounds and/or floor plans to know where the different topics occurred. So as you're moving through, again, we want to be as unobtrusive as possible, so you're not carrying a clipboard, you're not going like this and having other visitors wonder what on earth you're doing, let alone the guide. Even though the guides knew we were there, it wasn't a secret shopping expedition. But we wanted to be as unobtrusive. Only one person will go on a tour at a time, so there'd be one person with 12 or 13 regular visitors. But you had different techniques of trying to remember where some of those different themes were made present, and you also would draw the route of the tour on the map. So after you got back from the tour and filled out your form as completely as you could, this is what the map would look like. Once this was done and these other questions were answered, we had to move into data processing. And again, I know this is all small, that's sort of the point. The information about each tour iteration is then transcribed into spreadsheets, allowing us to track tendencies and variations. And that's what we were looking for. We were not going to say that this is the tour. We could say that at Mount Vernon, a standard mansion tour would likely cover, and then be able to talk about the most prevalent themes. And then say, well, occasionally a tour guide would work some information about the continuing legacy of enslavement in American society. You know, so we could give those ideas of themes and variations. And then we could code and interpret the qualitative descriptions of guide performances, visitor interactions, and other aspects of the tour as well. Finally, we would count up literally the number of tours in which topics were discussed in a particular room. So we could then see what themes tended to intertwine in which spaces. All right. So let's talk a little bit about how this all worked out a couple of years ago. So to set this up, in 2018, in part because of the research we had done in plantation museums in Louisiana, Charleston, South Carolina, and other places in Virginia, a staff member at James Madison's Montpelier, who worked with descendants of people once enslaved by Madison, reached out to us about conducting research at that site. We met with management and secured permission to survey visitors, interview some managers, and conduct narrative mapping there. Really generously, the Montpelier staff introduced us to their counterparts at Mount Vernon, Monticello, and Highland, and then after some negotiations, we were allowed to conduct research there too. Overall, and I won't get too much into this except for whatever questions you might have, our goal was each one of these sites had some relationships with the descendant community, the people who were descendant from people who had been enslaved at these 4 plantations. But they involved descendants in very different ways, some of which had some effect on the visitor experience. We kind of wanted to capture that. And that comes out more in the surveys and stuff with visitors, but it may come out a little bit in what I present from the documented tours as well. So, just in case you're not familiar with some of these sites. Mount Vernon and Monticello are 2 of the most visited historical homes in the United States. Before the pandemic, and we literally finished work at Mount Vernon in early March 2020, but They would estimate that about 1.2 million people toured Mount Vernon in a given year prior to the pandemic. About 400,000 visited Monticello in a given year. Visitor numbers at Montpelier, which is in Orange, Virginia. If you haven't heard about Orange, Virginia, I wouldn't be surprised. It's hard to get to. But about 100,000 people would visit Montpelier, and about 50,000 would visit Highland. Not that many people know about James Monroe. Of course, each of these sites was a working plantation during the lifetimes of the president, making each one of these men an enslaver. They, of course, that means they bought, sold, punished, and controlled the lives, at least partially, of hundreds of black men, women, and children. And of course, these enslaved black people formed the majority of populations of these sites throughout this period of their history. They had to do their best to make their lives there, find little moments of freedom and or escape from there. And these are the stories that, to some extent, all four of these sites were trying to figure out how better to present as part of their narratives. All right, a little more. So the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, which is the nonprofit that runs Mount Vernon, acquired Mount Vernon, we also call this the mothership of plantation museums, just before the Civil War. And the Northern Virginia site has been open to the public ever since. It was kind of the pioneer site of this kind of tourism. As of March 2020, a ticket bought you access to the grounds and exhibits and a tour of the mansion. On cold winter days, even on cold winter days, as you're waiting to get into the mansion for the tour. Now the museum also, it's not just about the tour, although that is kind of the central experience for most people. The museum installed an exhibit about slavery in what they called the slave barracks when the building was reconstructed in the 1950s. They started a Slavery at Mount Vernon tour that's been offered about once per day since the early 1990s. Also, because nothing is small at Mount Vernon, they have this massive underground education center that features a permanent exhibit on Washington's life, and while we were there, an exhibit called Lives Bound Together, which is about the connections between the Washingtons and Mount Vernon's enslaved community. That exhibit closed shortly after our fieldwork. Monticello in Charlottesville, Virginia, has been open to the public since the 1920s, and for most of their history, offered a tour of the house that used its unique architectural elements really to illustrate Jefferson as a brilliant guy. Throughout the 20th century, as you may know, Monticello and the Jefferson family resisted claims by the descendants of Sally Hemings that they were also Jefferson's descendants. But finally, they accepted the DNA evidence in the late 1990s. Earlier that decade, Monticello had begun a tour dedicated to the people Jefferson enslaved, and that tour is now offered as often as 8 times a day. I should say now, at least as of 2020. In addition, in 2019, they opened an exhibit they called the Sally Hemings Experience. That's sort of the shadow play that you see in the bottom corner, and that explored how she negotiated her relationship with Jefferson and got him to promise to emancipate her sons in his will. Moving on to Montpelier. Montpelier was acquired by the National Trust for Historic Preservation in the 1980s from the DuPont family, who had owned and lived on this Orange County estate for most of the 20th century. The Montpelier Foundation was set up to operate the museum and began operating house tours only in the 1990s. So it's the newest of the museums, and we think this matters. At both Mount Vernon and Monticello, years of telling the same story has created kind of a commemorative inertia, a resistance to change that makes fully integrating stories of enslaved people and discussing, especially this latter point, discussing Washington and Jefferson as enslavers very difficult. Montpelier didn't have quite the same baggage. Montpelier began its enslaved community tour in the early 2000s, although that's rarely offered more than 1 time per day compared to the house tour that's offered, every half an hour or so. Now, they did receive a large donation to rebuild Montpelier's South Yard, which is shown in the picture in the upper left. And in that, and in the basement of the mansion, they installed an award-winning exhibit called The Mere Distinction of Color, which is a phrase from one of Madison's writings, noting that that seemed to be what marked enslaved people as different than the white people who owned them. That exhibit has won awards, and it's very moving because it features voices of the descendants of the people that Madison enslaved, describing the lives of their ancestors. Let's stop with Highland. When first opened to the public, Highland was known as Ash Lawn, which is a name Dr. Massey, a later owner, used for the property. It's about a 10-minute drive from Monticello and gets a lot of visitors from Monticello. The College of William and Mary, which isn't located that close to it, was given the property in the early 2000s, and management has been reinventing the site ever since. They restored the name Highland to it in 2016, and a year later, an archaeological dig revealed the site of the actual Monroe House, which burned down in the 1830s. When we worked with Highland, they offered a tour of the grounds and the 1830s guest house, which is actually sort of cut off in that upper right picture. They also housed small exhibits about enslavement and other things in various outbuildings. Finally, they offered an augmented reality tour of the property, which of course makes anybody look very stylish. All right, so what did we find? As I said, at Mount Vernon, Monticello, and Montpelier, the house tour was the central experience for most visitors. In our surveys, between 85 and 90% of visitors take the main house tour. In Highland, of course, there was the only one guided tour, and that was the main experience. As our narrative mapping results will indicate, the narratives emerging from each tour usually wove episodes from the president's personal biography, maybe a little bit about their family history, with their contributions to the founding of the United States, and some other themes, and usually at least a mention of enslavement. All right, so here's the graphs. So at Mount Vernon and Monticello, when you just counted up how often these topics were mentioned on the tours at all, not spatially, as you can see, not surprisingly, their respective presidents and the furnishings were talked about on pretty much every tour. Enslavement was also at least mentioned on almost every tour, although more complicated topics like the continuing legacy of slavery in American society was something that Mount Vernon typically avoided. And it showed up a little bit more at Monticello, again, in part because of Sally Hemings and her descendants. Our data about tours at Montpelier and Highland yields similar results. Madison and Monroe, of course, were discussed on each and every tour. That's the whole point. But they were more likely to position Monroe and Madison within broader stories of American history, in part because fewer people know who these men were. People hear about Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, maybe are not as well known. Again, enslavement was at least mentioned on every, or almost every tour, but visitor experiences in these sites were at least a little more likely to understand that there's a legacy of this period of American history into the future. As you can see, it's a little bit higher than at Montpelier, or, sorry, than at Monticello or Mount Vernon. Now, that's a general overview. If we started to rank the tours, not surprisingly, again, at each site, the single topic ranked first almost all the time was the president at that particular site, Washington, Jefferson, Monroe, or Madison. This is what people come to see. This is what they expect. In part because each museum markets itself using these famous names. I don't know if you noticed, but the full name of each one of these plantations is George Washington's Mount Vernon. That's the formal name, Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. The organizations running these sites are what other scholars have referred to as reputational entrepreneurs. Even if they're nonprofits, that is the business they are in. of both keeping themselves running, but also they all include increasing people's knowledge of these four men in their mission and vision statements. So it's really the other dominant topics where you see variation. If you look at Mount Vernon, it's kind of surprising that national history is not ranked amongst the top topics on a tour nearly as often. Instead, it's all about furnishings. It's all about architecture. It's all about 18th century social life and culture. Mount Vernon seems to shy away from controversial topics. Also, to be fair, it's a much shorter tour than the others. You look at Monticello, a little bit more about national history, a whole lot about material culture. Again, as I said, if you go to Monticello, they'll talk about architectural elements and various inventions or modifications that the brilliant man Jefferson supposedly came up with. Montpelier and Highland, in contrast, are more likely to place Madison and Monroe within their periods of national history, again in part because the presidents are less well known. Montpelier's house tour also includes a fair amount on the lives of women, largely because they pay so much attention to Dolly Madison, thought of both as his intellectual partner and the woman who pioneered the role of First Lady. Well, visitors there often ask questions about art and furnishings. Discussions about such items were rarely ranked by us as amongst the top four topics. Note that while enslavement was present, it rarely ranked among the top four topics in the house tours. All right, so let's see what this looks like when we start mapping it. So again, every person who took a tour had to write down which themes were found in each room. We kind of collapsed some of them together to give us a more general picture. We plotted the route. And this gives us a sense of which themes were present in which spaces and gave us a sense of perhaps why. So this is Mount Vernon, and I know it's hard to fit everything on a slide. Basically, you start in a detached building called the Servants' Hall, and then get into the main part of the house. So in the Servants' Hall, they talk about slavery a lot, but they don't really talk about slavery. They say this is why we refer to people as enslaved people rather than slaves. So they're just like helping people understand the language. Then you get into the main rooms of the house, and it's all about George Washington, architecture, furnishings. You can look at that in a couple of different examples. You get to the central passage. Every guide almost pointed to this massive key hanging in a case on the wall. That's a key to the Bastille that Lafayette gave to Washington. So this was a moment, and they talked about it. You would then go upstairs, and the highlight of the upstairs part was where you saw Washington's bedchamber, and they talk a lot about the bed as the bed that Washington died on. So you hear about the furnishings, you hear it attached to Washington. The most common place for actual enslaved people to be named and discussed is the detached kitchen. If I go back, you see that's the end of the tour, and there they would name some of the cooks and talk about the tools they used to prepare food to deliver to the dining room where Washington and his guests might eat. When you look at Monticello, Monticello's a little different. Let me just say one other thing about Mount Vernon really quick. I don't know if any of you have been there, but most of the time, just to give you a sense of this tour, it is so crowded that they cannot have a single guide take you through the house. On the busiest days, you are literally standing in a line, shuffling through a room while an interpreter stands in the room and tells you, sort of on a repeating loop, what you're supposed to hear while you're in this room. And on the busiest days, you'd spend maybe 25 minutes in the house. It's sort of a disappointment, to be honest with you. And while Monticello receives a lot of visitors and can get pretty quiet, they managed to keep a guide together with a tour group of about 15 people as they work through the rooms of a house. On busy days, it does mean you might be here listening to your guide and overhearing a guide in this room talking to their groups. So there could be 4 or 5 tours in the house at the same time. And that, again, has an impact on your experience. So the tour starts outside on the east portico, and in the entrance hall, the guides will point out things like a large clock and other architectural features, again, as evidence of Jefferson's inventive mind, or, especially in the case of the entrance hall, where they have replicas of things that Lewis and Clark brought back from their expedition of parts of the Louisiana Purchase. And so that helped to attach Jefferson to that part of American history. Once the group goes to the third stop, the South Square Room, that is where you see enslavement attached to the narrative. This is the first of the private spaces of the home, and the guides will first point visitors' attention to portraits of Jefferson's white wife and daughter, and then, almost all the time, this is where they state that Jefferson and the enslaved Sally Hemings had a sexual relationship, and that Jefferson never, of course, recognized her children as his own. The other room where visitors are most likely to encounter stories of enslavement is in the dining room. Here, visitors are often asking questions about the dumbwaiter and revolving door that guides usually explain and talk about how they allowed enslaved servants to deliver food and wine to Jefferson's guests without ever being seen. Just that complicated relationship that Jefferson had. Now, when you look at some of the other spaces, like the parlor I used as an example here, this is where they talk more about Jefferson's role in national history, about where his intellectual ideas came from. So they might point at portraits of Isaac Newton, Francis Bacon, and John Locke while talking about Jefferson, but they will almost never talk about enslavement when they're talking about either him having the money to be able to pursue these intellectual ideas, or the fact that slavery was rooted in the development of the United States. In fact, when you look at the tour, the only place where national history and enslavement tend to not be segregated spatially is for the tours that actually ended, and not all of them did, at the end of what's known as the North Terrace. And there, guides would often talk about how Jefferson was morally opposed to slavery and did nothing to end it. And they would also often mention that Jefferson died in debt. And so when you die in debt, they auction everything off. Of course, that meant that they auctioned his enslaved people off in separated families, and that the auction was held here on the West Portico. So you could see that from the North Terrace. That was the most, again, really the only time where enslavement and the experience of enslaved were intertwined with American history in a meaningful way. All right. Montpelier is staged to represent Madison's retirement years. The tour starts on the front portico. Nellie is his mother, spends some time in there, moves through the drawing room, and again, once you get into the dining room, that is where you're going to hear the most about enslavement. Here, interpreters describe the life of Paul Jennings, who is Madison's enslaved butler. Jennings lived in the White House when Madison was president and wrote what some call the first White House memoir. So they know a lot about his life. In the dining room, you have these odd sort of cutouts, life-size cutouts of the famous people who would be sitting at the dining room table with Madison, and then in the corner is a representation of Paul Jennings. They also talk about Paul Jennings a lot in Madison's bedroom, talk about how he cared for Madison until the day he died, but some guides go farther, talk about Jennings after he was able to acquire freedom and acquire freedom for his family, and how his sons fought in the Civil War, you know, of course on the Union side, fighting for emancipation. But other than that, just as in Monticello, visitors are unlikely to hear about enslavement in spaces such as Madison's library, where Madison's role as chief architect of the U.S. Constitution and president are typically discussed. This again removes slavery from discussions of the founding of the American Republic. Highland is the only tour that is mostly outside, again, because the Monroe House doesn't exist anymore, which actually gives them some freedom that I wish they used more. Because once you're in a house and it's furnished, people start talking about the furnishings and the man or the family that owned the house. So a typical tour, although as you can see the thin green lines mean that some tours actually went on different routes. The typical tour started in the museum shop, used a couple of artifacts outside before going to the site of the Monroe House, where they'd show a picture of what it might have looked like, talk about the archaeological dig that discovered it, and before going around the house of Dr. Massey, which was an 1870s addition, to the guest cottage, which Monroe had built while he was president to house his visitors. So that's the only kind of authentic structure left. And while we were there, the rooms in the guest house were furnished as if they were Monroe's house. When you get into the guest house, you start in the study where, look again, they talk about Monroe, they talk about national history, they don't talk about enslavement. You have to go to, and if you're sensing a theme, the dining room to hear about the role of enslaved people. Seems like that's a space where you can imagine enslaved people working. So that was the most typical place where guides would talk about enslavement. All right. No, sorry. Now again, the counting, this is what you see in these graphs and maps, the ranking of prevalence of themes, mapping where certain topics were, is only part of our assessment. Again, to repeat what I said at the beginning, tour narratives are not just recited and received. They are performed by guides and negotiated with by visitors. All the emotion, sometimes conveyed by the guide through the use of solemn vocal tones or humor, and sometimes exhibited by visitors as their gazes sweep over a room and their senses react to what they hear and see. When positioning enslavement within the narratives that emerged in these plantation museum tours, we noted a variety of things about how guide performances and visitors' reactions had impacts on visitor experiences. And I think the best single story to talk about without not taking too much more time is this. So if you go back to Monticello and what I call the South Square Room, that's their name for it, where they introduced the relationship between Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. On one tour, we noted that a guide used a very serious and disapproving tone when explaining to visitors that a relationship between Jefferson and Sally Hemings could by definition not be consensual. She was enslaved. Also used that same disapproving tone to talk about Jefferson's decision not to acknowledge her children. So that's one experience, and you can imagine sort of the effect of people of hearing that and then having that perhaps inform your opinion of Thomas Jefferson. Same space, another guide, simply in a very matter-of-fact tone, said that Jefferson and Hemings had a relationship and that her children were fathered by Jefferson. And then tried to diffuse any potential tension by going, yeah, families are complicated. Very different takeaway. So just to illustrate that we were trying to get at that too. This just, so last year, so far we only have one piece published from this particular research. It's in the journal Memory Studies. Came out not quite a year ago. So sort of to summarize, by using narrative mapping as well as surveying visitors, my colleagues and I were able to show, and we started by presenting this research back to managers at these sites. So we're able to show them which themes tend to be present and absent on a tour, and more importantly, to show them how their guides and visitors attach themes to specific rooms and spaces. Basically, as you could see, we found that within the house tours, that central experience for most visitors at these sites, with the occasional exception of Monticello, visitors were unlikely to hear a challenge to the character of the famous historical figures that visitors came to learn about. On tour after tour, guides focused their attention on the Founding Fathers, often using tones designed to elicit feelings of respect and admiration. The furnishings and other artifacts were arranged to capture visitor attention, but were almost always used to enhance the president's biographies. It was rarely used to associate the house, the property, the fact that it was a plantation with enslaved people. Now, while most of these house tours featured at least some information on once enslaved people, including, as often as possible, their names and a description of the work they performed, narrative content related to enslavement tended to be placed in dining rooms and kitchens. And with the notable exceptions of Sally Hemings and Paul Jennings at Montpelier, biographical information that helped visitors associate with or fully identify, or more fully identify with, these women and men as people was usually absent. Again, it was much rarer for the institution of slavery to be present where guides and guests discussed the importance of Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe to American history. It tended to happen in spaces separate from those. Again, for more complete assessment of what we learned, please see our 2022 piece in Memory Studies. All right. Now this is the methodology. You see how we've used it. Let you see who else has been involved over nearing a decade of work on this project. But we certainly hope that this method can be used in other settings. Basically, as long as researchers can plot a tour's route and systematically document the material, affective, and narrative interactions among participants that occur along the route, they could adapt this methodology. If you change the instrument that I presented here, researchers could use narrative mapping to develop typologies of how heritage tourism sites stage these spatial narratives. Or perhaps they'd focus more on visitors' interactions with artifacts. One thing we noted that I didn't talk about here is 90% of visitors' questions are them pointing at something and asking about it. And often by saying, is that original? Or maybe they could focus more intentionally on the embodied action of guides. An interesting alternative would be to recruit visitors to map their own tour experiences, and then the researcher could summarize those. Finally, and we really hope this happens, that some of the sites we work with would adopt this narrative mapping methodology so they can better understand how their guided tours, exhibits, and artifacts are integrated into the experiences that visitors end up having by going on these tours. So, with that, what do you got for me? What questions?